taken straight from the Mississippi Plan playbook. But President Trump's own officials, President Trump's officials at the Department of Homeland Security declared that the 2020 election was the most secure election in American history. Some of my colleagues on this committee were on the same ballot as President Trump, and they're willing to accept the results that showed their re-elections valid. So if our elections are secure, these laws aren't really about integrity. What is the problem that lawmakers in Georgia want to address with the new law? The problem is obvious. Too many voters are showing up. Georgia law saw historic voter turnout during the last election. Among Georgia voters who returned absentee ballots, we get an answer to our question. 65% of those who returned absentee ballots voted for President Biden, 35% for Donald Trump. It seems Republican lawmakers in Georgia have concluded that the solution to their election problems is to make it harder to vote, because the voters who did vote in the last election were not their voters. That is fundamentally un-American. In the words of Senator Warnock, and thank you for joining us today, it is democracy in reverse. In our republic, politicians don't choose our voters, the voters choose us. We ought to enact legislation that makes it easy as possible to vote while ensuring our elections are safe and secure. There are a number of steps Congress can take to advance this goal, like the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, and enshrining an affirmative right to vote in the United States Constitution. I went back today to read the transcript and the reporting of the transcript of the January 2nd telephone conversation between President Donald Trump and Secretary of State of Georgia, Mr. Raffensperger. It was recorded. There is no doubt what was said in that conversation. The President of the United States, Donald Trump, was explicit. Here's what he said. I just want to find 11,780 votes, which is one more than we have. The President, who had 17 days left in his administration, hinted that Mr. Raffensperger and Ryan Germany, the chief lawyer of the Secretary of State's office, could be prosecuted criminally if they did not do his bidding. Here's what the President said. You know what they did, and you're not reporting it, he said. You know that's a criminal offense, and you know you can't let this happen. That's a big risk to you and to Ryan, your lawyer. That's a big risk, the President of the United States said in a conversation that was recorded. It's no surprise that this president goes on to claim not only several conspiracy theories, including debunked charges that ballots in Fulton County, Georgia were shredded, that voting machines were operated by Dominion voting systems tampered with and replaced. And Mr. Germany in this conversation can be heard telling the president that such charges are flatly untrue, even as Trump insists otherwise. You want to have an accurate election, and you're a Republican, Mr. Trump told Mr. Raffensperger. Mr. Raffensperger replied, we believe that we do have an accurate election. Trump responded, no, you don't have, not even close. You guys are off by hundreds of thousands of votes. I reread that to think for a moment about this state election official, Mr. Raffensperger in Georgia, who had the foresight to tape that conversation so that history would be clear, but also made it clear that an election where nearly 5 million votes were cast, the notion that they could find 11,780 votes, as President Trump requested, was just plain wrong. Of all the absentee votes, of all the votes in person, of all the activities that took place before and after the election, Raffensperger refused to concede that point. Well, I can tell you it cost him, because when it came time to pass the new laws, the Georgia legislature, signed into law by the Georgia governor, stripped the Secretary of State, Mr. Raffensperger's position, of his power to preside over the state election board. He paid a heavy price for being honest and courageous in that conversation with President Trump. The Secretary of State is also removed under this new Georgia law as a voting member of the state election board. Clearly, a majority of those who voted in the Georgia legislature were out to send Mr. Raffensperger a message that if you don't take the Trump line and follow it and allege that you found some votes that weren't counted or counted improperly. You'll pay a price for it. That is what we're up against here, and that's why this hearing is taking place. One of my heroes and friends and former colleagues, John Lewis, said, "The vote is precious. It is almost sacred. It's the most powerful, nonviolent tool in a democracy." Well, recent efforts to prevent Americans from participating in our democracy remind us how much work remains to protect this precious, almost sacred right. Now I'll turn to Ranking Member Grassley for his opening remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Now, we all know this is supposed to be a hearing about voting rights. Unfortunately, it's just the latest attack on one of our states for enacting election integrity laws. Pretty simple. National Democrats and big business have colluded to bully Georgia in retaliation for its new voting laws. But we'd be naive to think that they'll stop with the Peach State. Indeed, many of Georgia's new provisions are similar to those that we have in my state of Iowa, where we've experienced a record turnout and recently no instances of anyone being hindered from voting. I object to the title of this hearing. Like others on this committee, I'm a fan of history. I try to learn from it. I don't use it to insult my opponents. As I said, the title of this hearing is offensive. And as a student of history, this title diminishes the very real challenges and unfairness that minorities endured in the Jim Crow South at the hands of Southern Democrats. The right to vote should not be political. We should all agree that participating in America's democracy at the ballot box is a fundamental right. It's a right we should want to protect, and it should not become a political football. At a time when voters on both sides of the aisle have doubts about the integrity of our elections, polarizing rhetoric distorts history is not helpful. I'm eager to hear from Congressman Owens what he thinks about these comparisons of voter ID requirements to the evil system of legalized racial oppression in which he grew up. There's a lot of falsehoods being peddled about the new Georgia law. When President Biden repeatedly said that Georgia ended voting hours early, the liberal Washington Post gave him 4 Pinocchios in his fact check. Their fact checker was shocked that after the 4 Pinocchios, Biden kept repeating the same false claims. It goes to show that these claims about Georgia aren't about truth, they're about politics. And it goes beyond politics. The concerted efforts of liberals and their allies to mislead about Georgia's voting laws have had terrible effects on Georgia itself. There's an organized campaign started to make big business punish the people of Georgia for their political choices. When you make political comments and it hurts people's pocketbooks, it ought to be something everybody be offended by. Most infamously, Major League Baseball moved the All-Star game from Atlanta, a move that's likely to cost the city's economy 100 million jobs, and that's affecting the income of Georgians and probably some jobs in Georgia. A state senator lost his job at a prominent law firm after political activists took a break from fleecing their donors to get him fired for his work as a citizen legislator. When partisans and companies collude to ruin the livelihoods of their opponents, there's a term for that. It's economic terrorism. The American people don't like this. A recent NPR poll asked whether people support or oppose professional sports using their public roles, positions, and events to influence politics. 55% opposed it, only 40% supported it. On the other hand, the American people do like secure elections. A recent poll showed that 77% of the Americans support voter ID laws, including 74% of the independents. 66% even support voter ID for absentee ballots. 80% agree that states need to balance no excuse voting with election integrity safeguards. 93% say that the voter registration rolls should be accurately maintained, with 83% saying states should remove old registers. I don't get it when we hear, not just in Georgia, but other states, that there's something wrong when somebody died, that they ought to be removed from the voting rolls. In 2021, I'm not sure that apple pie would poll as well as the common sense election integrity. I can tell you the people of Iowa whom I represent like secure elections. That's why we recently passed laws to do just that. I have a statement for the record from our Secretary of State explaining how we work to make election laws easy and honest. This last election showed why secure elections are necessary. We'll be hearing from our Democrat friends that voter fraud is so rare that we don't need to take steps to prevent it. But in Iowa, 2nd District, Representative Marianne Miller Meeks won a race last fall by just 6 votes. That's 6. Every vote counts in Iowa, which means they better be legitimate. In fact, during each election in Iowa, we find numerous instances of double voting. It's not a big number, but it does happen. And with congressional races being decided by only 6 votes, it obviously matters. At the same time, I want to be clear. There's no evidence of anyone being unable to vote in Iowa due to our voting security provisions. All this talk about the importance of voting from Democrats is less than amusing. Just last month, Speaker Pelosi tried to use the power of her majority to throw Dr. Miller Meeks out of the House 2nd District in Iowa, even though her election was fully certified. It was fully certified by a committee of 3 elected Republicans and 2 elected Democrats. Her opponent didn't want to admit she lost, but she skipped court, and Democrat super lawyer, who, by the way, is facing sanctions in Texas, tried to change the results of the House instead. When people will stop at nothing to win races, it's more important than ever that our election laws be secure. Sadly, my friends on the other side seem to disagree. Elections and voting legislation that's been proposed in Congress will take away the ability of states to establish their own voting rules. I hope to hear from Secretary Gardner why it's so important for states like Iowa, New Hampshire, and Georgia to manage their own elections, and why federalized election rules are bad for election integrity and for voter participation. I hope to hear from President Pro Tem Jones about what really happened in Georgia, not the made-for-TV headlines about Jim Crow 2021, but a sensible, fair, common-sense effort that they made to increase voter confidence in their election. Basic claims of voter suppression are just as corrosive to our democracy as baseless claims of voter fraud. And we heard too much about that from last November. We should all be committed to making elections accessible and secure to maintain the confidence of the voters. And when I hear about voter suppression and the loser in this election lost by more, with more votes than anybody loser ever in the history of the country got, and the winner won by more than any winner in the history of elections, and you're telling me about voter suppression, the way people turn out? Give me a break.
Thank you, Senator Grassley. We're speaking about what happened since that election in state legislatures across the country. Since 2014, Senator Leahy has led the efforts in the Senate to restore the Voting Rights Act. Due to a conflict with the Appropriations Committee hearing this morning, he may not be able to question witnesses, but he's asked to make opening remarks, and I'm going to extend the same courtesy to Senator Cornyn after Senator Leahy is finished. Senator Leahy.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I do appreciate the courtesy. I think it's excellent that you're holding this timely hearing. I think this is the greatest crisis facing our democracy today. I look at my own state of Vermont, where everybody can vote, is encouraged to vote. We do everything possible to vote. We elect a Republican governor and a Democratic lieutenant governor. Every vote counts, and we make sure they do. And people in my state look at what happened in the Georgia legislature. They cannot understand that is happening in the 21st century. You know, the 2020 election should be a great source of pride for our nation. We suffered through a deadly pandemic, but even so, more Americans voted in 2020 than in any modern time in modern history, both Republicans and Democrats. But instead of celebrating that significant achievement, the former president mounted a campaign of misinformation, spreading the big lie that widespread voter fraud led to his defeat. And his disinformation campaign led directly to the violent assault on the nation's capital that took the lives of 5 Americans. I was proud when the Republicans and Democrats in Congress stood bravely together amid the broken glass in ransacked offices to reject the former president's big lie. I was proud that we crossed party lines to certify one of the most secure elections in our history. And when Republicans and Democrats came together again days later for the inauguration of President Biden, America sent a powerful message to the world. Neither a deadly pandemic nor a violent insurrection could defeat our American system of self-government. Now, that was just 90 days ago. But instead of capitalizing on measures that resulted in the highest voter turnout in over a century, dozens of states have moved forward to restrict access to the ballot. As of March, more than 360 bills have been introduced in state legislatures to make voting harder for Americans. These cynical efforts have been justified on the grounds it should be harder to cheat, which of course falsely implies that voter fraud was a widespread problem. Did we not just go through an election where there was virtually no evidence of voter fraud, and it was looked at by the courts, and that's the conclusion they came to? Did we not just reject a violent attempt to overturn our election based on the utterly false claim that was stolen through fraud? Now, I realize memories may be short, but this wave of voter suppression laws is premised on a little bit more than the big lie with a slapdash paint job. If you rejected the big lie then, you should oppose these efforts today. We should all easily agree that when any voters in any party are disenfranchised, our democracy suffers. Depriving Americans of the foundational right to vote also denies them representation in our democratic republic. It's exactly why the 1965 Voting Rights Act, which helps the federal government prevent voter disenfranchisement, has been bipartisan. Every Congress from 1965 to 2006 repeatedly reauthorized the Voting Rights Act on a bipartisan basis, including in our body, Mr. Chairman, in 2006 by a vote of 98-0. Now, among those who joined me in voting yes in 2006 were Ranking Members Grassley, Senator Graham, Senator Cornyn. The reason the Voting Rights Act has always been a bipartisan bill is it's pro-democracy, not pro-Republican or pro-Democrat. So I hope will be increased support for the already bipartisan John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. It just restores the federal government's powers under the Voting Rights Act. Without Section 5 powers, which my dear and close friend John Lewis, a hero to many, called the heart and soul of the Voting Rights Act, no administration of either party has the necessary tools to prevent states from enacting changes making voting more difficult for Americans. And as we watch almost daily, states unleash a wave of ill-founded laws that restrict the precious right to vote, not protect it, but restrict it. The oversight role of the federal government envisioned by the 1965 Voting Rights Act is more urgently needed than ever. all of us, Republicans and Democrats, to remember what we saw and how we felt on January 6th. We should all recall casting our votes in the twilight hours of January 7th in our capital, the seat of our government that bore the fresh wounds of a violent attack that sought to deny the American people's will. On that day, we put aside our partisan differences in defense of something much bigger than political party, our democracy itself. In the months ahead, Mr. Chairman, I hope we can answer that same call to defend our sacred right to vote, the right that gives democracy its name. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Leahy. Senator Cornyn.
Thank you, Senator Durbin and Senator Grassley, for holding this important hearing today. This is an important topic, but I don't think we do justice to this topic by entitling this Jim Crow 2021. Unfortunately, rather than the usual oversight and fact-finding and legislating process, it looks like today's hearing is really just performance art in order to enhance a false narrative about how far we've come in this country, thank goodness, when it comes to minority voting rights participation. The right to cast a ballot, of course, is the cornerstone of our democracy. It's the process through which the will of the people is heard and turned into action. The very basis for the legitimacy of our laws is the consent of the governed, and they consent by electing their public officials at the ballot box. I believe our standard should be that we should make it easier to vote legally in America, but also at the same time make it harder to vote illegally. Well, sadly, the right to vote was denied to a generation of Americans based solely on their gender or race. This type of discrimination stands against in stark contrast to the founding principles of our country. And I hope I can speak on behalf of everyone in this room when I say we need more Americans to participate in our democracy, not fewer. In Texas in 2020, we had a historic turnout of registered voters, 66% of registered voters of all ethnicities and race. Just as Americans have a right to make their voices heard in our elections, Congress has a responsibility to make sure those elections are fair and free. If we don't have fair and free elections, we don't preserve the core constitutional right of the people to make their voices heard through the ballot box. Expanding voter access does not have to come at the expense of common sense guardrails and protections that preserve the integrity of the ballot. For every one person who votes who is unauthorized or is disqualified to vote, that dilutes the vote of legitimate and legal voters. And disparaging those same common sense protections like voter identification as Jim Crow 2021, or in other words, racist, is false and I believe dangerously so. Our founders understood that all power ultimately resides in the hands of the people. When government takes its power away from state legislators, it is effectively seizing power from the people of those states to hold their elected officials responsible. This is very important because our founders gave us a roadmap, in other words, the Constitution, as to the power residing in the hands of the people through their ability to hold their state legislators accountable. Article 1, Section 4 explicitly gives the states the power to regulate, quote, the times, places, and manner of holding elections, close quote. Congress may, however, quote, at any time, make or alter such regulations except as to the place of choosing senators. I read this to mean that the states are to chart their own course for elections, subject to guardrails, and where necessary, Congress can provide additional guidance, but cannot hijack the process entirely. Nowhere in the Constitution does it empower the federal government to completely usurp the role of the states in holding elections. Indeed, nowhere does the Congress have the authority in one of its enumerated powers, as reflected in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. In a recent gerrymandering case, Chief Justice Roberts noted that the framers assigned the issue to the state legislatures, expressly checked and balanced by the federal Congress. Yet through H.R. 1, Congress is not acting as a check, It's acting like a hijacker to take over the constitutional authority from the states and acting as the sole arbiter as how an election is run in rural Vermont or downtown Chicago. This past election, for example, we had the highest turnout ever in a presidential election. According to network exit polls, the number or percentage of African Americans who cast their ballot is roughly the same as the percentage of the African American population in America. I'm encouraged by this trend of more people voting and hope it continues. I agree we should have this hearing and we should look at appropriate bipartisan solutions to improve voter access. But using charged rhetoric to describe aspects of state voting laws like the one in Georgia is misleading. It's not constructive, and it undermines public trust in Congress and in our election system. In fact, as we've learned, the Georgia law comports with the existing laws of many Democrat-run states and also reflects the safeguards supported by the bipartisan Carter-Baker Commission. This is not to say that there's not more work to be done, but it is important that we temper the charged rhetoric and understand the specifics that we're actually talking about, rather than jumping headfirst into this debate across the country in a rush to judgment. Here's just one example. The Georgia provision requires a free ID card in order to receive an absentee ballot. That's nearly identical to the provision in the 2002 bipartisan bill supported by then Senator Biden and the current chairman of this committee. Indeed, the Help America Vote Act would have required everyone voting in a federal election to provide a copy of a photo ID. And if they don't have one, they can get one or provide a copy of the bank statement, paycheck, government document, or utility bill. In other words, they can do it for free. I don't think this is a radical proposition to suggest that voting identification coupled with the offering of free ID cards is a radical restriction on voting. It just doesn't hold up. To the contrary, it's a basic safeguard to preserve the right of people to vote and for their vote to count equally in a free and fair election. And this safeguard helps inspire public confidence at the same time. The Carter-Baker Commission, Jimmy Carter, James Baker III, named for them, looked at preserving the integrity of our elections, and they reached the same conclusion. The electoral system cannot inspire public confidence if no safeguards exist to deter or detect fraud or to confirm the identity of voters. Photo IDs are currently needed to board an airplane, to enter a federal building like this one, to operate a motor vehicle, to cash a check, to buy alcohol, and pick up will call tickets at the Major League Baseball games. I support efforts to expand voter access, but these efforts cannot interfere with the integrity of our elections. Today's hearing is an excellent opportunity to discuss that and expanding access to the ballot box for all eligible voters. I appreciate the chairman and ranking member holding this hearing. Not so much the title of the hearing, but I do think the subject matter is important, and I'm eager to hear more from today's distinguished witnesses.
Thanks, Senator Cornyn. Today we welcome two members of Congress to testify, Senator Reverend Raphael Warnock of Georgia and Congressman Burgess Owens of the 4th District of Utah. In addition to representing the state of Georgia after his election earlier this year, Senator Warnock serves as senior pastor of the historic Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta, where our late colleague, Congressman John Lewis, was a member. Senator Warnock, could you please proceed with your statement?
Thank you, Chairman Durbin and Ranking Member Grassley and members of the committee for inviting me here today. I'm especially glad to join these distinguished witnesses. Mr. Chairman, I've come here today to stress the critical need for the federal government to act urgently to protect the sacred right to vote. America is a land where possibility is born of democracy. Our vote is our voice, a chance to help determine the direction of our country and our own destiny within it. Record numbers of Georgians use their voices and voted in the last election. And in response to this swell in Democratic participation, politicians in our state legislature responded not in celebration, but with retaliation. They could have gotten busy having not seen the outcome that some of them wanted. They could have gotten busy changing their message or adjusting their policy. Instead, they got busy changing the rules as if the democracy belongs to them and not the people. We've seen voter suppression bills since the election in November and January all across this country. 360 voter suppression bills in 47 states, an increase of 100 bills since I highlighted this issue on the Senate floor just a month ago. As of today, 5 of these bills, including in my own state of Georgia, have been signed into law. These efforts vary in exactly how they suppress voting. Some new laws, like in Georgia, will make it harder to vote by mail. Some will make lines that are already too long longer. Harder to cast a provisional vote. The new law also gives state politicians, some of the same politicians who still today refuse to acknowledge President Biden's lawful and decisive victory, the power to override local election officials. We may be tempted to dissect these bills as if analyzing them piece by piece makes them more rational. But that narrow analysis only obscures the larger, unmistakable picture. This is a full-fledged assault on voting rights, unlike anything we have seen since the era of Jim Crow. For all of their differences in exactly how they suppress the vote, what these bills all share is that they are predicated on the big lie, that the outcome of our last elections were the result of fraud, or at least the presidential election. I guess the members who won their elections are okay with that outcome. The truth is, politicians in their craven lust for power are willing to sacrifice our democracy by using the big lie as a pretext for their true aim. Some people don't want some people to vote. To be sure, we've seen these kinds of voter suppression tactics before, aimed at the same communities. They are part of a long and shameful history in Georgia and throughout our nation. But that history is also filled with moments of hope and promise, when our nation has come together in recognition that preserving our democracy is absolutely essential. Voting rights are preservative of all other rights. Just 15 years ago, the United States Congress reauthorized the Voting Rights Act of 1965 under a Republican president, and with a bipartisan vote in the Senate of 98-0. At the time, our colleague, Senator Mitch McConnell, praised its passage, declaring it a law that would make a difference for all of America. Many members of this committee, including the chair and the ranking member, enthusiastically voted in favor of it. That was 2006. Why shouldn't voting rights legislation be just as bipartisan now in 2021 as it was in 2006? Voting rights should always be bipartisan. It is not the difference between right and left, but the difference between right and wrong. Many argue that the United States Senate is dysfunctional and incapable of governing in a bipartisan manner. We can boldly refute these claims by coming together not as Democrats or Republicans, but as supporters of democracy itself to pass the For the People Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. Together, these two bills would turn the tide against state-level voter suppression proposals all across our country. These pieces of legislation would expand and protect access to the ballot for every citizen, Democrats, Republicans, and independents, because strengthening our democracy does not benefit one party over another. Instead, democracy reform benefits all of us by ensuring that our government is of the people, by the people, and for the people. John Lewis was my parishioner. I was honored on many occasions to stand with him as we took people to vote after church at Ebenezer. He understood that our democracy transcends all else, and he nearly died on the Edmund Pettus Bridge defending it. Today, our country faces the most widespread assault on voting rights since that era. The four most powerful words in a democracy are "the people have spoken." The highest and most sacred action that the Senate can take is to protect the right of the people like it did in 1965. As we move forward in this discussion, I've asked myself on many occasions, what would have happened had we not passed federal legislation affirming the covenant of our democracy in 1965? Where would Georgia be? How would it prosper on the other side of a segregationist curtain? If we had not acted in 1965, what would our country look like? Surely I would not be sitting here, only the 11th black senator in the history of our country and the first black senator in Georgia. And maybe that's the point. It concerns me that some don't hear the irony in their statement that we must protect minority rights in the Senate while refusing to protect minority rights in the society. We've got to act. History is watching us. Our children are counting on us. And we must pass federal voting rights legislation no matter what.
Thank you, Senator Warnock. Senator Grassley, would you please introduce your guest?
It's a great pleasure to introduce him, and most people probably know him better as an outstanding NFL football player, but it's my pleasure to introduce Congressman Burgess Owens. Congressman Owens represents the great state of Utah, along with our colleagues, Senator Mike Leahy and Romney. Congressman Owens is a new addition to the House, and we're so pleased to have him here with us this morning.
Thank you, Chairman Durbin, Ranking Member Grassley, and members of the committee for the invitation to join you today at this hearing. My American story begins with my great-great-grandfather, Silas Burgess, who arrived in America as a child, shackled in the belly of a slave ship. Silas was sold on an auction block with his mother in Charleston, South Carolina, to the Burgess plantation. He escaped through the Underground Railroad and later became a successful entrepreneur, purchasing 102 acres of farmland paid off in 2 years. My grandfather, Oscar Kirby, served our country in World War I and was a respected and successful farmer, raising 12 children, all of them graduating from college. My father, Clarence Burgess Owens Sr., was stationed in the Philippines at the end of World War II. When he returned home to Texas, actual Jim Crow laws denied him a postgraduate education. Raised in a generation that used this as motivation, he received his PhD in agronomy at Ohio State University and had a successful career as professor, researcher, and entrepreneur. I grew up in the era of actual legalized institutional racism. I grew up in the Deep South in Tallahassee, Florida, in the 1960s during the days of KKK, Jim Crow, and segregation. My first experience with white Americans was at 16 years old. At 18, I was the third black athlete to receive a scholarship to play football at the University of Miami. Now I proudly represent Utah's 4th Congressional District in the U.S. Congress. I sit today before you as someone who's lived the American dream, as have millions of other Americans of all races from every background. This is due to our country's mission statement that all men and women are created equal. A mission statement that every American should have the equal opportunity for life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But as someone who's actually experienced Jim Crow laws, I'd like to set the record straight on the myth regarding the recently passed Georgia state law and why any comparison between this law and Jim Crow is absolutely outrageous. Here are a few examples of my own life of what Jim Crow laws actually look like. At the age of 12, my father allowed me to participate in a demonstration with college students in front of the segregated Florida State Theater, where because of our color, we could not enter. I was the youngest participant there. Only 50 years later did I learn that my father had parked across the street to watch and make sure I was safe. In the 7th grade, my school never received new books. Instead, we received books from the all-white school across town. At service stations, there were white men-only restrooms, white women-only restrooms, and a filthy restroom in the back of the station for Black Americans designated as colored. In addition, Jim Crow laws like poll tax, property tests, literacy tests, and violence and intimidation at the polls made it nearly impossible for Black Americans to vote. The section of the Georgia law that has brought so much outrage from the left simply requires any person applying for absentee ballot to include evidence of a government-issued ID on their application. If a voter does not have a driver's license or ID card, that voter can use a current utility bill, bank statement, government check, paycheck, or any other government document that shows a name and address of this voter. If a voter somehow cannot produce one of these above forms of ID, that voter can still vote and cast a vote, provisional ballot. By the way, 97% of Georgia voters already have a government-issued ID. What I find extremely offensive is a narrative from the left that Black people are not smart enough, not educated enough, not desirous enough for education to do what every other culture and race does in this country, get an ID. True racism is this. It's projection of the Democratic Party on my proud race. It's called the soft bigotry of low expectation. President Biden said of the Georgia law, this is Jim Crow on steroids. With all due respect, Mr. President, you know better. It is disgusting and offensive to compare the actual voter suppression and violence of that era that we grew up in with a state law that only asked the people show their ID. This is the type of fear-mongering I expect in the 1960s, not today. And by the way, literacy tests and poll tests were initiated by the Democratic Party. The intimidation of Black Americans by the KKK was initiated by the Democratic Party. Jim Crow, that I grew up in the South, of segregation, was initiated by the Democratic Party. The soft bigotry of low expectation now projected on Black Americans, not Italians, not Asians, not Polish, not Jewish, but only Black Americans, is being done by the Democratic Party. Where Black misery today thrives and is prevalent, lack of education, lack of jobs, high crimes, the call for defunded police is all done in Democratic parties. By increasing illegal votes and not giving voice to those legal Americans, Black Americans, who are seeing and waking up today is the real tragedy of this process. We're seeing 18% of Black men turn away from the Democratic Party because they're seeing that their vote can count and their future can matter. We're seeing twice the percentage of Black women doing the same. A record number of Hispanics, Asians, and gay community members doing the same. So no, all Americans expect, very simply, is fairness, security, to walk away from the poll booth knowing that my vote counted. If we didn't win, we work harder next time to make sure our message resonates. But to call this Jim Crow 2021 is an insult, my friends. For those who never lived Jim Crow, we are not in Jim Crow. And for Black Americans to go out every single day and vote the way we feel we should is a right that we should have and not being demeaned by something 60 years ago in which we had no right to do any of the above. Thank you very much.
We will now turn to our panel of witnesses. We thank the members for attending. Today, we welcome 5 witnesses to testify about the latest assault on the fundamental right to vote. I will introduce the majority witnesses, then I'll ask Senator Grassley to do the same for the minority witnesses. Our first witness is Professor Carol Anderson. She's the Charles Howard Candler Professor of African American Studies and Chair of African American Studies at Emory University in Atlanta. Professor Anderson's research focuses on public policy and the intersection of race, justice, and equality in the United States. She's the author of multiple books, including White Rage, The Unspoken Truth of Our Racial Divide, and One Person, No Vote, How Voter Suppression is Destroying Our Democracy. Sherilyn Eiffel is well known to the committee and others. She's the president, director, counsel of the NAACP Legal Defense and Education Fund, a civil rights organization founded by Thurgood Marshall in 1940 that has led some of the most significant legal battles for racial justice and equality. She first joined LDF in 1988 and took over as director counselor in 2013. Finally, the Honorable Stacey Abrams, joining us from Atlanta. She served for 11 years in the Georgia House of Representatives, including 7 years as Democratic leader. In 2018, she became the first Black woman to be the gubernatorial nominee for the major party in the United States. After witnessing the voter suppression efforts during the 2018 election, she launched Fair Fight and Fair Fight Action to protect the voting rights of Georgians and other Americans. Ranking Member Grassley, would you please introduce your witnesses?
Yes, I'm going to introduce Speaker Pro Tem Jan Jones, and then Senator Cotton is going to introduce Secretary Gardner. So it's my pleasure to introduce Ms. Jones. In her nearly 20 years in office, Speaker Jones has distinguished herself as an advocate for changing lives and increasing economic opportunity through improved public education and government that responds to the people. She was elected by her peers to serve as the highest elected woman in the Georgia General Assembly in 2010 after serving as Majority Whip. She has authored various bills involving local control, transparency, and accountability. She has also done much to reform Georgia's K-12 education. Speaker Jones lives in Milton, Georgia, with her husband. She is a graduate of the University of Georgia and has an MBA from Georgia State. She's a businesswoman and a mother of 4. I thank her for appearing today. Senator Cotton.
Thank you, Senator Grassley. I am pleased to introduce New Hampshire Secretary of State Bill Gardner, the longest-serving Secretary of State in the country. Secretary Gardner was first elected to serve the people of New Hampshire in 1976, just 1 year before I was born, and Senator Grassley doesn't even want to know how many years before Senator Ossoff was born. He's been serving for that long because he has been serving the people of New Hampshire so well. I would point out that Secretary Gardner is a Democrat, and of course I'm a Republican. I'm sure there are probably some things we don't agree on, but I invited Secretary Gardner to appear because this is not a partisan issue, or rather it shouldn't be. Free and fair elections administered by our 50 state governments are an American issue. That's what our founders intended, and that's why there is bipartisan opposition to these bills that would federalize our state-based system. Secretary Gardner is well positioned to talk about these problems and how this bill would wreak havoc on our elections, but more fundamentally, he can talk about the real problem, the fact that this legislation is a complete takeover of our federal election system. I want to thank Secretary Gardner for being willing to testify. I would suggest to all of those watching that the longest-serving Secretary of State in America and a Democrat has a lot to say that we should probably listen to before we make radical changes to our state-based election system.
Thank you, Senator Cotton. The procedure will follow today. We will swear in the witnesses, and each witness will then have 5 minutes to provide opening statements. There'll be one round of questions, and each senator will have 5 minutes, and I ask them to please try to stay within their allotted times. I would like to ask all the witnesses, and they are in remote status, to please stand in place to be sworn in. Raise your right hand. Do you affirm that the testimony you're about to give before the committee will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? I'm going to assume that all witnesses answered in the affirmative. Thank you all. Professor Anderson, please proceed with your opening statement.
Thank you for this opportunity to speak with you about the history of voting rights. I will focus on 3 key themes that echo powerfully in today's electoral landscape. 1, the target of disfranchisement. 2, the use of race-neutral language to evade the 15th Amendment. And 3, the cloaking of disfranchisement under the banner of election integrity. In 1890, during the rise of Jim Crow, legislator James Big Chief Vardaman bragged that the sole reason the Mississippi legislature revised the state's constitution was to eliminate the Negro from politics.